I present two figures for your perusing mind's eye. In the Palace of Versailles, the court and political hub of the Sun King Louis XIV of France, a figure walks its halls. He is quite the figure, described by one courtier as being decked out like a woman. He is married to an English princess, but also has many male lovers, including a handsome chevalier of renown. He is both a dapper figure who will spend lavishly on clothes and ornaments, and a great general who successfully led campaigns against the Dutch. Now we move to a cell within the Bastille, the notorious French prison. There is a man there, apparently, the spitting image of the young Louis XIV, held as a potential threat and otherwise not much to look at. He is broken out by a faction opposed to the current king and seeking to replace the young Louis XIV with his twin as a puppet ruler. The plot is quickly thwarted, and the twin is forced to return to the Bastille and wear a metal visor which will not be raised on pain of death. Both of these people share a name: Philippe. Certain creators of fiction and satire have a lot to answer for. Hello, ladies and gentlemen and everyone in between, and welcome to this year's final episode of Author Talks. I, Thomas Wrightson, an author, have a number of things to talk about and sum up. But first, I'd like to take you on a small journey through one piece of historical fiction I find interesting, not because of the original text, or necessarily for how the story was adapted over the years, but the historical figure who shares a name with a figure pop culture knows as the Man in the Iron Mask. Le Vicomte de Bragelonne, or 10 ans plus tard, translation The Vicomte de Bragelonne, 10 years later, was written between 1848 and 1850 by Alexandre Dumas and his frequent ghost collaborator Auguste Maquet. It is the third and final part of the D'Artagnan romances after The Three Musketeers and 20 years later. Set within the early rule of Louis XIV, it follows the varied paths and fates of the four musketeers of old, the titular D'Artagnan, and his three old companions Porthos, Athos and Aramis, who have become divided by time and political beliefs. This book is long. Modern editions that bundle all its contents are rare, usually splitting it into 3 books: The Vicomte de Bragelonne, Louise de la Vallière, and The Man in the Iron Mask. Altogether, it is likely they would probably run to 2,000 pages easily. And out of all of them, you probably know of only one, the third and final part. Out of all Dumas' work, The Man in the Iron Mask has received the second largest number of adaptations behind The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. I've even seen a couple of them. To potentially turn too much into a Dominic Noble imitator, seriously go watch him, he's very good, they're not the most accurate to the book's plots, especially with their resolution and how the musketeers are involved. But the most interesting aspect of this story, and how it plays into Dumas' trend of reinventing French historical figures in fiction, is what this episode is about. Firstly, and perhaps most surprisingly to me, this man apparently existed. L'homme au masque de fer was a state prisoner of Louis XIV during the late 17th century, with his death in the Bastille being recorded as 1703. Known by many names and held in multiple prisons associated with persons embarrassing to the state but needing to be kept alive for whatever reason, the exact nature of his crime and who he was before being imprisoned remain either hotly debated or unknown. The most that's been spoken is that he may have been a valet. He has become quite the figure, and prisoners you've seen with metal or full-face masks are likely drawing on his cultural image. Although according to primary sources, the prisoner didn't have an iron mask, but instead a black velvet one. So he probably should have been called L'homme au masque de veilleuse. Many theories arose that the man was an embarrassing relative of Louis XIV, from Voltaire hearing stories that the prisoner was an illegitimate half-brother born from Anne of Austria, and popularising the myth of the mask being iron due to a mistake, to later writers including Bagnol and Cubière popularising the theory of an identical twin. There was quite a bit of speculation surrounding the events, as Louis XIV was an unexpected arrival in a marriage that had grown cold and distant, from a mother who had suffered multiple miscarriages. But all that is concretely known is that this prisoner was someone the state wanted kept locked away, and whose crime and real name were never revealed. Most of what's known now has been pieced together through surviving documents in archives and context clues. Second, and just as, if not more interesting, we have Philippe I, Duc d'Orléans, the younger brother of Louis XIV by 2 years. While described in his youth as being intelligent and witty, he also suffered greatly from the need of the then regents to both nullify any potential threat he would pose to his brother and keep him as a dependent of the royal household. So he was confined away from much of his family and encouraged by his mother Anne of Austria to not be too masculine. Anne also used the nickname My Little Girl for him. When Louis XIV created his unique court-focused rule at the Palace of Versailles, Philippe was part of his noble circle. He was known for being flamboyant, extravagant, and by the late 1650s, his preference for men was well established. Obviously he was carped at and derided due to the religious and social norms of the time, but he was the king's brother, so he saw little to no active censure, provided he played the game of Versailles properly. His best-known lover was the Chevalier de Lorraine, whom Philippe took into his personal household. But don't think Philippe was just a fop at court. He proved himself a military leader of some potency, leading successful battles in the War of Devolution, later campaigns against the Dutch, and roundly defeating the army of William of Orange. He also expanded and enriched his family and estates, becoming the financial and blood founder of the Fourth House of Orléans. Through his son by his first wife, Henriette of England, he was also the grandfather of Louis XV, the penultimate king of the First Bourbon dynasty. Enter Dumas and Marquette, who took the identical twin theory and ran with it, embellishing it into the nub of a grand conspiracy. And they decided that in their wisdom the imprisoned man would not only be a secret twin brother to Louis XIV, but would also be called Philippe. Not even a different spelling. That's not confusing at all for anyone, especially as the actual Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, is still present in the story. In the second volume, Louise de la Vallière, the marriage of the real Philippe to Henriette of England and her later intrigues are a core part of the plot. Here comes the Dominic Noble imitation, albeit with a Thomas Wrightson lens. Something that I recall being surprised by when I found out about the book for the first time was how comparatively small this episode is. In popular media, it's taken on this grand proportion, or rather, one part of the Vicomte of Bragelonne 10 years later, being the man in the Iron Mask. There have been other stories based on the idea, but many draw directly from Dumas' work. Compared to every other part of the D'Artagnan romances outside the very first book, The Man in the Iron Mask has seen dozens of adaptations. It has been noted that the stories are very much about the maturation of Louis XIV into a wise monarch, with the stories as a whole being very much on the side of monarchy. This is something that appears to be uniformly dropped in favour of turning the original Louis into a selfish, cruel tyrant, and the fictional twin into a compassionate figure. Of course, the true Louis XIV was much more complicated, a man shaped by personal tragedies and a culture of fear who created a cult of personality and absolute rule as the Sun King. Something in the book that may surprise readers who only know the story from its many adaptations. The plot to replace Louis XIV with his twin fails. In practically every mainstream adaptation, the substitution of the twin Philippe with Louis XIV is successful after varying levels of shenanigans. But in the original book, while initially seeming successful, the twin is re-imprisoned. On top of that, the whole Iron Mask thing happens after this attempted coup as Louis XIV's punishment, not any time before it. It is telling of Voltaire's and Dumas' influence, regardless of how well the actual books are remembered today, that the idea of Philippe the twin stuck in an iron mask is perhaps the more immediately recognisable figure than the queer conqueror and courtier Philippe I, Duc d'Orléans. To me at least, for modern readers and writers, this real Philippe is infinitely more interesting and entertaining than an invented twin. He didn't die tragically in court intrigue as one might think would happen to a paranoid king's queer brother, but instead played the game of Versailles and won, establishing vast estates and military victories, and he died naturally at an advanced age. He lived a full life. The original prisoner is also interesting in his own right, more so when you consider the recent research. A man, possibly a valet, who witnessed or found something so damaging that he was imprisoned in secret for the rest of his life? No need to make him a twin. Also, his aesthetics are much more appealing. Velvet masks are stylish and light. Iron masks are just so gauche. And it wasn't even mandated. The prisoner was made to wear the mask by one of his jailers off his own bat. I know from reactions to my writing that I lean into the dramatic, including many established techniques and tropes, but sometimes my theatricality needs limits. And one of those limits is a cumbersome iron thing wobbling around on your head and bonging against every surface. But it's also telling of Dumas' style. If you've read the original Three Musketeers or The Count of Monte Cristo, you know that he and Marquet went hard for overdramatic theatrical props. An island cave filled with unimaginable wealth, intrigues between famous court faces who probably wouldn't have been near each other. It's the Clive Cussler method. There, I said it. Okay, minor rant over. Now on to the closing business and summaries. This year was intended to be a quiet time, focusing on my studies and work, but it turned out to be anything but. Beginning in July, when my script won the Audio Presentation Award at the Pen to Print event in London, I've been working with Chris Gregory of Alternative Stories on The Angry House, a horror audio play. That includes many meetings, many edits, and going down to London to record with a great 4-person cast who struggled occasionally with my dialogue. But then, writers who barely ever think about the poor people who have to actually say the thing. Sadly, things at my publisher have been moving slowly, which isn't that surprising when you consider that they're based in the United States. And the United States is going through what is probably the worst presidency in its history. But also, I've been needing to pull myself out of a slump that lasted most of last year and a chunk of this year. We've had health complications in the family, stressful periods, the death of one of our dogs, and other things that needed me to take stock. This podcast has also shifted format this year, from unscripted ramblings to scripted episodes on everything from my writing journey to Sinbad to Mass Effect. It has been a challenge, he says as he's writing out this sentence. But it's also been fun adopting this format, and I think it's come out as having a better quality overall. Thankfully, I do know where things are now. The Angry House is going through post-production and is set for a release this December, while the third cluster cycle book, The Murderer's Lament, is going into line edits. The other two are available, links to the second one are in the description below. I've also been branching out into my YouTube work beyond this podcast, and my video on Fabula Nova Crystallis has been doing extremely well. It's part of how I'm trying to take control of how I publicise myself with what I love, not trying to fit myself into a pre-existing mould. That's starting to get deep, so I'll wrap this up by saying, stuff's happening, stuff's coming slowly but surely. And I'm going to carry on with the paths I've selected as not only being profitable, but enjoyable. And while the world's dark and unpleasant at the moment, there is a silver lining. We've survived and triumphed before in the face of oppression and blindness. And while it'll be a discouraging slog, we can but continue being who we are. If you've reached this point, thank you for listening. This is the last episode of this podcast for this year, though I may or may not have a video out depending on whether I feel inclined to write up something and create it about whatever it is. That didn't come out as I intended, but it's been a long year. Otherwise, I wish you all a merry time during whatever holiday you celebrate in midwinter. Until next time, see ya! Le Vicomte de Bragelonne au dit Le Vicomte de Bragelonne au dit un plus tard. Le Vicomte de Bragelonne au dit un. Le Vicomte de Bragelonne or do thing something what's it. Translation, the Viscount of something whatever, so many years later. Alexandre Dumas, your titles. Enter Dumas and Marquette. Enter Dumas and Marquette, who took the identity... You know, outside of the title of the book, I'm having remarkably little trouble with the various French names and French terms here. I think that's my head for languages showing a little, thank goodness. And he died naturally and beginning in July with my script. But also, I've been needing to pull myself out of a slump that lasted more, and while it'll be discouraging as a slog, if you've reached the end